Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so we are here. Here's the thing. Okay, so King Thor is a monthly series, right? It's a 4-issue series as far as I'm aware, but it's a monthly series. So the next one, I want to say part 3, at the time that we're recording this video, part 3 comes out on November 20th, and then I want to say part 4 comes out towards the end of December, like December 18th or something along those lines. So we've got a little bit before we get to the conclusion of this, but this story is amazing. Okay, so for those of you guys who are unfamiliar, this basically concludes Jason Aaron's run on Thor, right? Like King Thor is the end of his run on Thor, which I will still say to this day, and I've read Walt Simonson's Thor, this is the best run on Thor that I think there's ever been. It's insanely good, from like the original God of Thunder up to Jane Foster Thor, all the way through All New, All Different Marvel to the War of Realms, all the way up until now. It is fantastic. Like, it's amazing how good it is. So what this does, and this is something to kind of explain here, right? It's been a while since we did the original Thor God of Thunder. Now, you guys are welcome to go check that out if you want like a really in-depth perspective on what's going on. But essentially, this is in the far-flung future. Basically, at least it was until the end of God of Thunder, all life on Earth had been destroyed, right? And it was wiped out by Loki. Loki was the one who killed everybody on Earth, all the superheroes, the whole 9 yards. Earth was just like this giant barren wasteland. But even with that being the case, at the end of Thor God of Thunder, Thor had basically planted the seeds of life to be reborn on Earth, right? So life was basically flourishing and it was coming back, so on and so forth. As for the other realms that are part of the Asgardian mythos, they're all basically dead. Jotunheim and Muspelheim and all that. The only one that I think that has any real measure of life in it is Niflheim, and only because of the realm of Hel, with Hela ruling over everything. But even then, I don't think we have an answer on what's going on with her. As far as we're aware, pretty much everything in the universe is dead, right? It's at a point where everything's beginning to come to an end. And so what this does is this picks up at the Library of Worlds. Now, the Library of Worlds was this library that Jason Aaron created, whereby it had all this information on gods, right? You could go to this place and you could basically research all these different gods across the entirety of the universe, right? And learn all about them and all these different things. But this place is basically being investigated by the daughters of Thor. And the reason isn't initially made clear. Instead, as they're making their way through it and as they're looking through everything, they end up coming across Shadrach. Now, Shadrach, he was one of the cooler characters that Jason Aaron created. This is why Thor God of Thunder was so incredibly good. Shadrach, when he originally appeared in Thor God of Thunder, I think he said he was like the god of music or something along those lines, but it actually turned out he was the god of bombs. And the idea behind this was that Gorr the God Butcher had basically been seeking out a way to create this giant god bomb, right? To create this bomb that could be thrown into the time stream and then wipe out all gods in existence from the very beginnings of the universe all the way until its end, right? Because he hated gods, right? He cursed gods because he lived in an exceedingly harsh environment and he believed the gods of his world had turned their back on him. And that's the reason why he had lost his wife and his children and so on and so forth, was because he believed that the gods simply just didn't care. So we'd gone on a crusade to kill all the gods across the universe. That's the entire basis behind the Thor the God Butcher storyline. It was absolutely amazing. But Shadrach seems to have survived all of this, right? He seems to have made it all the way to the very end. And when the question is asked how it was that he managed to pull this off, the response is that originally when you had the librarian who was there basically taking care of all these books, all this knowledge that had been gathered over the eons, all these stories that had been told about all these exploits of these gods that had always been in existence, that as they were all being killed off by Thor, of course, those stories have been told. But as you got towards the end of the time stream, eventually the librarian basically died of old age. And as a result of that, Shadrach had taken over for him and tried to keep the library together as best he could. But again, you're at the end of all things here. And so basically it's kind of the collapse of everything, kind of the end of everything. And that's the question that's asked by the daughters is, we're here to seek help, to find something that can help us for what's to come, for basically like what's going to happen with the end of things. Now, it's cool to sort of see this play out because what they kind of seem to be alluding to is the idea of like Galactus with the all-black Necrosword, right? That's kind of what we saw at the end of Thor God of Thunder, is that Galactus had attained the all-black Necrosword and then gone forward as like, Galactus, the all-black Necro world eater, or whatever it is that you want to call it. But he was just like this super dark energy powered cosmic being, right? That seemed to be the case that was going on. And that looks like what it is that they're referring to, in the sense of like, this is what's to come, it's all going to go to pieces, and they're trying to find help with this. And so what it does is it switches over to basically the final battle between Thor and Loki, between old King Thor and Loki. And this is a battle that's been a long time coming. And that's kind of one of the cool things that gets said here. But what we end up learning is that Loki has actually attained the all-black Necrosword for himself. Now, this is when our explanation of the all-black Necrosword timeline begins to come into play, right? Because there's some things about how Loki got this sword that we need to cover, right? So the idea behind this all-black Necrosword really originates with Null, the symbiote god. And that's why this is so cool, right? Because it ties into everything that goes on. That when the universe came into existence, prior to that, you just kind of had this giant expanse of emptiness. When the universe came into existence, that basically the Celestials started creating life life and so on and so forth. Now, following the timeline of the Ultimates, insofar as Al Ewing's Ultimate Avengers storyline with Adam Brashear, with Blue Marvel and Black Panther and all that kind of stuff, we can presume the war between the aspirants and the Celestials broke out. But regardless of the circumstance, the creation of life in what was previously this massive empty void that was occupied by Null was seen as a kind of encroachment onto Null's territory. And as a result of that, Null basically fashioned the all-black Necrosword as a weapon that could be used to kill Celestials, which he was initially successful in doing, but ultimately defeated. Following that, the Sword of Null basically fell into the hands of Gorr the God Butcher when Gorr cursed the gods, and then 2 gods fell down to his planet. And so as a result of that, Gorr the God Butcher took the sword and then went on his campaign to kill all these different gods across the universe. Ultimately, Gorr was defeated by Thor from 3 timelines, from this future version here, and then the modern day Thor in the main Marvel universe, and then Thor in the past from the main Marvel universe. And so as a result of that, ultimately he was defeated. That basically led to the all-black Necrosword bonding itself to Galactus, and then Galactus going forward as basically the Butcher of Worlds. Following that, and going into Thor issue number 700, Galactus was confronted by Ego the Living Planet, and ultimately the Necrosword, the all-black, bonded itself to Ego, who in turn consumed Galactus, and that basically led to Loki facing off and really kind of challenging Ego during Thor volume 5, issue number 5, and issue number 6, when Loki defeated Ego and then took the Necrosword for himself. And that's kind of how you run into the situation where Loki currently has it now. And it's a cool thing to see, right? Because Loki having this all black, he looks like Gorr, but he also looks really, really cool. The funny thing about this is that Thor really begins to sort of consider the fact that he cannot defeat Loki, that Loki can't really be defeated by King Thor himself. And in truth, that's a true statement, right? I mean, Loki wielding the all black Necrosword, there's no way that Thor can really beat him. And the reason why is because with the battle between, Thor and Gorr the God Butcher, it took 3 Thors in order to defeat Gorr. And ultimately, it was being in the right place at the right time, right? Where Thor was able to absorb the all black into himself, take 2 hammers, and then defeat Gorr that way. But what you're talking about here is where Gorr was basically a singular mortal being who was bonded with immense power, that Loki is immortal, right? Like he's basically this god, more or less, who now has the power of the all black. There's no way that Thor can beat him. And Thor muses about that, right? Like one of the things that he does is he actually sends his hammer to the far side of a star in order to bring it back while it's on fire. And because they're on a world with basically napalm for water, he ends up basically blowing the world up, right? Like using his hammer, touching it down to the water, and then setting the world on fire, setting off like these massive nuclear explosions. At the same time that happens, Shadrach recalls what it is that he's a god of, that he's actually a god of bombs, and ultimately ends up blowing up the entire library of worlds. And in the process, it seems like it, although I wouldn't swear to it, but it seems like the daughters of Thor are killed in the process. Now, I'm not going to swear that's the case, and we're going to have to wait till issue number 2 to find out. But the cool thing is that during this battle between Loki and Thor, Loki is quite handedly tearing Thor apart. The funny thing about this is that Thor basically casts Loki into the sun. Now, initially, Jason Aaron kind of plays this in a scenario where it's like, and now Thor's won, right? It's almost kind of how he plays it off, until Thor basically talks about how it doesn't really seem like it would be enough, and it wouldn't, right? I mean, yes, like the sun is a pretty huge thing, right? In terms of like the amount of energy it puts off, the amount of pressure you have in a star, but it's not enough to kill Loki, not by a mile, especially with him using the all black. And so coming out of this thing, ultimately the fight breaks out, yet again between Loki and Thor. And the funny thing is they end up back on Earth, right? So what you end up having is almost this identical scenario where you end up having 2 gods who are fighting each other that crash land on a planet. It's like the origin of Gorr the God Butcher. And it's kind of a funny thing because we're not really given the perspective of the people on this world, right? Like whether or not life is harsh. It doesn't look like it. There's trees and there's grass and all that kind of stuff. So these people really seem like they're having more of a pretty basic lifestyle as opposed to like an overly complicated one or a very harsh one like what Gorr was going through. But where Loki basically says like, this is the end, like you are going to die now. And it's actually in the process of getting ready to kill Thor. Suddenly Loki is stabbed through the back. And it's just like I remember I was looking at this and I was like, what in the heck? Because my initial thought was Loki had lost his sword and the sword came crashing back down to Earth and ultimately ended up stabbing him in the back, right? Like he was stabbed in the back by his own sword when it fell. But then of course, Loki falls down next to Thor in a manner that's reminiscent to Gorr the God Butcher. And then these words come out of nowhere. And it's like 2 omnipotent brothers fighting over nonsense. This is why I hate your kind. This is why all gods need to die. And this is when we basically end up finding out that these words are emanating from the greatest enemy that Thor has ever faced. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, Gorr the God Butcher has returned. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comics Explained, cliffhangers, if you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.